Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The trouble did not arrive with thunder. It crept in on soft feet, the way mist slips over the bonny river at dawn, settling on corrugated roofs and bare shoulders until everyone wears it without knowing. That Sunday in Okori Bend, the air smelled of wet wood and palm oil, and the road outside St. Ida's held the patient heat of noon. Jonah had been leaning on the peeling fence with the lazy assurance of a man who believes the river will always bring fish to his net, his shirt open at the throat, a toothpick tipping between his lips like a flag of mischief. He bantered with boys who measured afternoons by the arc of gossip, letting their jokes tumble like dice. Then the church doors swung and let out a hush, the kind of hush that follows prayers when people walk carefully, as if the holy words are still sitting on their heads. Miriam stepped into the light with her Bible tucked close, not as armor, not as ornament, but as something stitched to her breathing. Her dress was cornflower blue, simple as the first page of a school book, and the sun caught the edging where a needle had argued with cotton. She did not strut, she glided, the way a canoe glides when a practiced hand knows the current's mood. Jonah saw her, and something restless in him rose like steam. He snapped his fingers and called her name, as if calling a goat from behind a shed. Miriam! That Bible go turn husband one day. The laugh that followed had wings. It flew from his friends and perched on the fence, on the mango leaves, on the church wall, a chorus with no music but plenty of teeth. Miriam paused and cast him a look without salt, without sugar, just clear water. She did not argue. She did not tremble. She held her book tighter, gave a nod no bigger than a blink, and continued, the dust curling around her ankles like obedient cats. It was then, in the crack between his joke and her silence, that something faintly sour curled at the back of Jonah's tongue. But pride is a drum. Once it starts beating, it wants to be heard. He spat into the dust, adjusted his cap, and called another joke to drown the small, inconvenient truth that his laughter had scratched a place he could not reach. Okori Bend had always been a place where time moved like a patient goat, nibbling the edges of days until they disappeared. The smoky chatter from Mama IBI's frying pan rose each morning as if it were an offering. Children ran barefoot, learning arithmetic from market scales. Elders sat under the almond tree, weighing the world with stories older than the river. Jonah's skin carried the river's scent like a second name. From Port Harcourt's bustle to the silent mangroves near Abanima, he knew where the tilapia hid, where the catfish sulked, how the tide preened itself before going out. He liked his jokes the way he liked his cast nets, widespread and catching plenty. Words for him were stones skimmed across water. If they bounced, he felt like a king. That Sunday, after Miriam's quiet exit, he swaggered a little more, accepting slaps on the back, letting the grin sit on his face like a masquerade mask that didn't belong to him but fit too well to refuse. Yet the day kept returning the same unwanted echo. He tried to drown it at the waterfront, loading baskets, tying knots, teasing Timmy about a torn sandal, but every splash sounded like a question he had no patience to answer. When the evening bled into a copper sky and the birds passed in dark strokes, old Tamuno appeared the way an old song returns, uninvited but necessary. The man's beard had gathered more salt than the sea, and his eyes were peppered with distances. Jonah, he began, voice like gravel in a calabash, if you laugh at a traveler's sandals, be ready to carry him when his feet bleed. Jonah smirked, tossed his chin toward the church, and said, Baba, the girl no day even look person face. Bible no be food. Tamuno's mouth folded into something between pity and patience. Bread no be river, but you drink water when you choke. He patted the young man's shoulder and went away, leaving a wake of old wisdom that Jonah refused to swim. Night gathered, lanterns bloomed like yellow flowers, drums from a naming ceremony fluttered from the far end of the town. Somewhere, a generator coughed and settled. Jonah lay on his mat later, counting the ceiling boards, the taste of his own joke dull as sand. Sleep came like an errand boy who forgot the address. Morning rose with a thick yawn, pushing dew-off leaf surfaces and calling women to the market road that eventually found its way to Port Harcourt. The city sat to the northwest like a big cousin, loud, sharp, and always busy reciting its own name, while Okori Bend kept its shyness. Miriam's stall appeared each Tuesday near the red umbrella where pepper glowed like coals and yam tubers lounged like sleeping hippos. She weighed tomatoes with steady fingers, spoke in a voice that carried no sugar ants, and counted change as if each naira note had a heartbeat. Jonah pretended not to notice the way she now drifted past him like a moon that had revised its orbit. He began a game with himself. He would look away and then glance quickly to catch some proof of injury on her face, some bruise where his laughter had landed. Instead, he saw a calm lake. She greeted everyone, a mechanic from Aleem smelling of diesel, a teacher from Okrika with chalk still clouding his cuffs. She greeted them with the same evenness, the same tender efficiency. Not him. It wasn't spite, it was absence. It stung like a slap delivered by a feather, soft, but it knows where to land. He told his friends jokes that rolled like cola nuts, laughed too loudly, bought suya from a boy who swore he had cut it from the tender cheek of luck, and swaggered to mask the hollow place he still refused to name. An afternoon rain swept in from the direction of Yenagoa, straight-backed and uncompromising, and the market scrambled into a dance of polybags and elbows. Miriam remained unruffled, covering her goods with old newspapers, the headlines wrinkling into umbrellas. Jonah watched her move with the calm of someone who kept time by a different clock. They say Lagos never sleeps. Okori Bend yawns on schedule, but whatever measured Miriam seemed to beat under her skin, closer to an ancient private drum. He felt, for the first time, the truth that a person can walk beside you and still be traveling a road you can't see. The thought unsettled him like a lizard falling from a ceiling. By the next Sunday, the heat wore a uniform, and even the wind saluted lazily. Jonah told himself he had business near St. Ida's, but the lie had too much polish. He went because the silence in Miriam's eyes had started to feel like a question mark branded into his chest. The church sang a hymn that floated like soap bubbles along the road. Children in white socks kicked dust with sacred ankles. An old woman fanned herself with a raffia fan whose rhythm could have driven a canoe upstream. Miriam emerged again, the blue dress traded for a pale yellow one that made her look like early harmattan sun squeezed into cloth. He stayed quiet this time, his friends conveniently absent, the fence newly humble under his elbows. She walked by with that same steady grace, and he, in a moment as brief as a match flare, imagined a life he had never dared, standing beside her in a small room in Port Harcourt, counting coins not for beer but for a zinc roof, teasing her gently, not cruelly, holding a future in calloused hands as if it might break but trusting it not to. The vision startled him so much he almost reached out. He didn't. The moment folded itself and slipped into a pocket he could not open again. Miriam nodded, the way one might salute a familiar landmark, and kept moving. Behind her, a motorbike grumbled past, bearing a sack of Gary and a radio that babbled about traffic in ABA and a tournament in Benin City. Life clattered on. Jonah felt like a man who laughed at thunder until rain carried away his yam barn. He went to the river in the evening and cast his net with more force than skill, the line cutting his palm, the water returning his strength with a shrug. A heron watched him from a stump, solemn as a magistrate in a wherry, and the sky folded into indigo as if the day were closing its eyes. He told himself that nothing had changed, that a joke is a joke, that tomorrow would arrive on the same bus as today. But night has a way of telling the truth. When he finally lay down, the ceiling boards arranged themselves into a sentence he did not want to read, and the drum of pride, suddenly shy, learned a quieter beat. The morning began with the sound of paddles striking the river, the rhythmic slaps echoing against the mangrove walls like a drummer testing his sticks before a festival. Jonah was already awake, sitting by the low window of his mother's old kitchen, staring at the market road as if it might answer the questions he could not voice. The previous evening had left him restless. The way Miriam's face seemed untouched by all his antics had taken root in his mind like a stubborn weed. The kettle hissed on the coal stove, and he poured the steaming water over his Gary, watching the grains swell and turn pale. Every spoonful tasted like sawdust, but he forced it down, unwilling to admit that his appetite had been stolen by silence. By the time the sun had fully climbed over the rusty zinc roofs, the town was awake. Women called out the prices of their goods, and the smell of roasting maize wafted in from the roadside. Jonah grabbed his fishing basket and set out for the river, telling himself it was a day for work, not wandering thoughts. The truth clung to him anyway, invisible but heavy. On the way, he passed a group of men sitting under a breadfruit tree, debating politics with voices loud enough to challenge the morning birds. He greeted them, and one called after him, "Jonah, when next will you make us laugh?" The question was harmless, but it carried a weight he didn't like, as though laughter was now a currency he owed the world. He waved without replying and kept walking, the crunch of sand under his feet filling the spaces between his thoughts. Down by the river, the tide was low, exposing black mud streaked with shells and the ghostly shapes of crabs retreating into holes. He set his basket down, pulled off his shirt, and stepped into the water, letting it wrap around him like an old friend. The river didn't care about his moods, his words, or the way a woman's quiet could unsettle him. It only cared that he pulled in his nets and gave it the respect it demanded. That he could do. By midday, the heat had turned the air thick, making even the palm trees seem reluctant to sway. Jonah hauled in a decent catch, enough to earn him a small profit in Port Harcourt, and decided to take the fish to town himself. The journey from O'Corry Bend to the city was a slow crawl of wooden boats and battered minibuses, each carrying stories in the form of passengers, sacks of goods, and radio voices competing with engine noise. He arrived at the city's bustling waterfront, where the air was crowded with the smell of diesel, salt, and fried plantain. The market women shouted over one another, their voices braided with urgency, and wheelbarrows clattered past with loads of rice, yam, and smoked fish. Jonah found his usual buyer, a round-faced man named F, who weighed the fish with the precision of a jeweler. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the state of the river before Jonah pocketed his money and drifted into the heart of the market. It was here that he saw her again, Miriam, standing beside a stall where she was arranging neat piles of peppers and garden eggs. The city seemed to press around her without touching her. The noise and chaos slid off her like water off taro leaves. She didn't notice him at first, focused on a customer, an elderly woman with a woven basket and a slow smile. Jonah lingered by a pile of plantains, pretending to inspect them, just to watch her hands work, steady, deliberate, unhurried. When she finally looked up and their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, but not a trace of the old familiarity. She gave a small nod and returned to her task, as if he were no more remarkable than the stall's wooden frame. The dismissal was gentle, but it settled in Jonah's stomach like a stone. He walked away, weaving through the crowd, carrying the strange realization that a person could erase you without bitterness, without anger, just by choosing to live beyond your reach. On his way back to O'Corry Bend, Jonah took the longer route by road instead of the river, sitting in the cramped back seat of a bus with worn-up upholstery and windows that rattled with every pothole. The man beside him, a talkative trader from ABA, spoke endlessly about profits and losses, the cost of cement, and how the roads had worsened since last year's rains. Jonah nodded occasionally, but his mind was elsewhere, tangled in a web of thoughts that felt too large for the confines of the bus. He remembered the first time he had ever spoken to Miriam, years ago, when she had come to buy fresh fish with her younger cousin. She had smiled then, an unguarded, sunlit smile that made her seem both younger and older than her years. The memory jarred him now, clashing with the cool indifference she had shown earlier. When the bus stopped to pick up more passengers near a junction in Aleem, Jonah stepped out for air, breathing in the roadside mix of dust and roasted corn. He bought a cob from a young boy and stood there eating it, watching motorbikes weave dangerously through traffic. Somewhere in that moment, between the crunch of the corn and the hum of the road, he realized that Miriam's silence was not a wall meant to keep him out. It was a door she had closed gently behind her as she walked into another life. Whether she had done it because of him or in spite of him no longer mattered. The effect was the same. The bus horn jolted him from his thoughts, and he climbed back in, the taste of roasted corn suddenly bland in his mouth. By the time Jonah reached O'Corry Bend again, the sun had softened, casting a golden film over the town's familiar shapes. Children chased each other through narrow alleys, their laughter skipping over puddles left by an afternoon drizzle. Jonah walked home slowly, his basket empty now, his earnings tucked into the pocket of his shorts. He passed old Tamuno's house and saw the man sitting outside, mending a fishing net with fingers that moved like they were plucking secrets from the air. "You went to the city today," Tamuno said without looking up. Jonah nodded, unsure if the old man expected more. "The city shows you what you didn't know you were looking for," Tamuno continued, "but it also shows you what you've already lost." The words hung there between them, neither invitation nor accusation, and Jonah found himself unwilling to ask how Tamuno seemed to know the shape of his thoughts. He left with a polite nod and continued down the path to his mother's house, the river's faint murmur guiding him like a half-forgotten song. That night, as he lay on his mat, he tried to think about fishing routes, about repairs his boat needed, about anything that wasn't Miriam. But the mind, like the river, has its own tide. and when it turns against you, no amount of paddling can change its course. The day the convoy came, the air in Okori Bend felt as if someone had wrung it out and hung it back, damp and gleaming, for everyone to wear without complaint, and even the river seemed to hold its breath, flattening its usual ripples into a polished stare that could see its own reflection. Jonah had risen early, not out of discipline but because sleep had grown stingy with him, and he wandered the market road, watching the stalls stir awake like old cats stretching in cautious sunlight. He bought kunu from a girl whose eyes were too wise for her years, tipped the cup back, and tried to swallow the knot that had been living in his throat since the last Sunday, since the day he realized a smile can pack its bag and leave a person without slamming the door. The first hint was the dust, a low, advancing ribbon, the color of ground ginger, sweeping the road before the vehicles themselves, which glided around the bend with the dignity of cows that knew they were safe from the butcher. Black SUVs with tinted windows, paint so deep it looked like it could drink a man's shadow whole, engines humming as though reluctant to bloom into real noise. Children who usually chased lizards for sport began to chase the convoy, bare feet drumming the dirt like rain on a tin roof, mothers shouting caution that arrived second to curiosity. A few men stood, chewing on toothpicks and commentary, and someone muttered, this one is government smell, as if power had a scent you could fold into cloth and wear. The vehicles rolled to a halt near the square where the almond tree kept its umbrella of shade and old talk, and from the first SUV stepped men whose sunglasses looked like they could deflect questions, their suits hurrying to catch up with their shoulders. Then he appeared, taller than rumor, lighter skinned than the posters, Governor Samuel Dandogo of Rivers, his agbada lifting slightly in the breeze as though greeting the town on its own behalf, smile trained to be generous without becoming intimate. He removed his cap for a moment, and the women near the palm wine stand gave a small, involuntary sigh, the kind reserved for a leader who looks like an answer even if no one remembers the question. The pastor, alerted by a whisper that outran shoes, came trotting with his Bible held like a precious letter, and the chiefs lined up in their coral beads, each man's greeting a careful measurement of bow and handshake, as if the governor's palm could weigh their futures. Jonah hung back by the plantain stall, not hiding, not showing, the way a man might stand at the edge of a story wondering if it is calling his name or merely practicing vowels. In Port Harcourt, processions like this were regular enough to breed shrugs, but here each gesture rang like a bell, and every pause stretched long enough for 10 new rumors to be born fully grown, names already stitched to their chests. By noon, some people swore the governor had come to commission a borehole, others swore he came to settle a chieftaincy dispute, and one old woman with a thumb that always knew where pain lived insisted he had returned because the spirits of the river missed him. The governor moved through the market like a man learning a language by listening hard, nodding, asking, paying attention not simply to faces but to the invisible strings that tied them to the stalls, the baskets, the boys who darted between knees like eager punctuation marks. He stopped to buy roasted plantain from Mama Ibi, who had temporarily forgotten how to bargain, and accepted his money with the trembling joy of a person who had just seen rain after a stubborn dry season. Near the pepper stall, a group of schoolgirls in neat braids began to whisper in the speed of new gossip, flitting glances between the governor and the row of vegetables that looked as proud as a parade. It was then that Jonah saw Miriam standing a few paces away, neither pushing herself into the light nor shrinking from it, arranging garden eggs in a pyramid, so precise it could convince an engineer. Her dress was a soft green that framed her like a leaf frames dew, and her hair was tied back with a care that declared a quiet discipline, a tidy but not fearful relationship with the world. She did not notice the governor first. She noticed a little boy who had dropped a coin and was searching the dust for it, and she bent, found it, pressed it into his palm with a smile that gave the day a second sunrise. When she finally looked up, the governor was there, his gaze catching on her the way cloth catches on a nail that holds more than its size suggests. Their eyes met, and the market seemed to lower its volume, not out of respect but curiosity. Even the flies circled more slowly, as if waiting for a translation. The governor said something simple. No one near enough to hear would agree on the exact words later, and Miriam answered with the measured politeness she had shown to the boy, to the teacher from Okrika, to the woman bargaining for a basket of tomatoes. Jonah felt, at that distance, something shift, like a canoe getting caught by a current you cannot see but cannot deny, and he understood that history often begins with small courtesies while the drumbeat of fate is still clearing its throat. By afternoon the leading rumor had matured into a story with legs, arms, and a side profile. The governor, it said, had recognized Miriam from a charitable program in Port Harcourt months ago, had admired her careful accounting, and the way she refused to leave the hall until everyone's numbers matched their faces. He had asked her name then, the story continued, and stored it somewhere in that vault behind his calm smile, bringing it out now like a coin saved for exactly the right market. Whether any of this was true mattered less than the way it felt true. Truth, in a town like Okori Bend, often wears garments tailored with needle and thread borrowed from the tailor, the carpenter, and the comedian, all adding a stitch until the cloth looks ordained. After a prayer at the graveside of his mother in the small cemetery, a stop that gave the visit its solemn spine, the governor returned to the square to meet elders formally, speak of roads, of youth apprenticeships in Bonny Island, of a planned health center on the route toward Aleem. His words were measured rice, neither overcooked nor stubborn, and people ate them in the shade, grateful to have something that sounded like a plan. Somewhere in the weave of those formalities, Miriam was invited to the old town hall, where an aide with an efficient voice and a notebook that seemed to write itself asked her to help coordinate vendors for a forthcoming community drive, and her yes came not from awe but from the same place as her meticulous stall, a spine that preferred its work sturdy rather than loud. Jonah lingered along the hall's outer wall, pretending to be interested in a poster about vaccination schedules and road closures, but his ears tilted against his permission, catching the rhythm of people's footsteps inside, the low murmur of administrative weather. He felt a sensation he had not felt since boyhood, standing outside a classroom where his name had been posted beside a grade that shamed his swagger. Except this time the measure was not arithmetic but timing, courage, the luck of being seen when you are ready. He told himself stories to fill the gap. Maybe she would stumble, maybe the governor would forget her face, maybe this was a small wave pretending to be a tide. Yet even as he thought these petty protections, he knew a larger wind had turned. The pastor's wife walked past, gave him a smile that held grace and the soft humor of someone who knows the play and refuses to spoil it, and Jonah, in return, offered a grin with too many bricks showing and too little house beneath. Evening arrived with the unhurried authority of a traditional ruler arriving last to his own gathering, and the convoy prepared to leave under the kind of sunset that makes even the poorest house look like it owns its colors, each wall insisting on the dignity of its paint, however chipped. The security men loosened their stances by degrees that only training could teach, and the almond tree released small, dry sighs, as if satisfied with the day's gossip harvest. Miriam stepped out of the hall with a small folder pressed to her side, walking without fuss toward the road, and Jonah saw again what he had seen from the beginning but refused to name. She moved as though someone had squared the corners of her life, not by miracle, not by accident, but by habit, by work, by a patience that did not trumpet itself. The governor paused to speak to a group of youth leaders, his voice dropping into a register that felt friendly without admitting intimacy. And then, as if it were the simplest thing in the world, he turned toward Miriam and offered a polite half-bow that carried the weight of attention without the heat of flirtation. They exchanged a few words. She laughed, not loudly, not coquettishly, but with a clear bell of humor that seemed grateful for oxygen. From the cluster of onlookers came a soft, collective intake of breath, the sound people make when a door opens onto a room none of them expected to visit. The convoy pulled away soon after, engines threading into the evening's fabric until they became a distant hum, and the dust settled like tired applause. Jonah stood very still, palms on his thighs, as though bracing himself against a wind that was late but determined. Old Tamuno appeared as the light thinned, his shadow arriving before his body, and said nothing for a long moment, letting the quiet do the heavy work. Finally, he tapped his knuckles gently against Jonah's arm, the way one knocks at a friend's door before entering a difficult conversation. "You have felt it now," he said, voice soft enough to make the words a secret between them. "When the river chooses a new path, even the crocodiles must learn fresh turns." Jonah wanted to argue, to claim that paths are made by feet, not by water, that willpower and charm and a quick tongue can drag destiny back by its collar. But the evening had already written a different kind of mathematics, and he could not unlearn its sum. He watched the road toward Port Harcourt until it turned into nothing, and then into night, and then into a thought. Some laughter buys you a meal, and some laughter taxes your sleep. The church that morning wore a different air, as though someone had swept the walls with invisible brooms and polished the benches with anticipation. Even the brass bell outside, which normally stumbled through its own clanging, seemed to ring with its chest lifted, like a singer who finally found the right key. Jonah arrived early enough to see the choir rehearse a hymn, their voices weaving into one another like colored threads on a loom. The harmonies spilling out into the street, where women in headscarves adjusted their wrappers and children tugged on shoelaces. He had told himself he was only coming to keep a promise to his mother's memory, a small yearly ritual of attendance, but deep down he knew that excuse was as thin as onion skin. The truth was heavier and sat behind his ribs. He wanted to see Miriam, to confirm whether the undercurrent he had felt that day in the market had been a passing eddy or the beginning of a tide. As people streamed in, he noticed more suits than usual, more perfumes that didn't belong to the humid air of Okori Bend, more handshakes that took a second longer than politeness required. By the time the governor's convoy appeared at the far end of the road, the congregation had arranged themselves into a posture of reception, backs straighter, smiles polished. Jonah stood near the third row, between a trader from Elim who smelt faintly of kerosene, and a boy who kept humming to himself, oblivious to the growing hum of power moving closer. The governor entered with the grace of someone trained to navigate both palaces and puddles, exchanging nods with the elders, his igbada whispering against itself. Miriam walked beside him, not clinging, not trailing, but moving in perfect parallel, like a verse that completes the melody without drowning it. She wore a cream-colored dress that softened the light around her, and her hair was pinned with such precision that it seemed every strand had been consulted before finding its place. The sight unsettled Jonah in a way he could not name. It was not jealousy exactly, nor pure regret, but a mingling of both with a pinch of awe that made him feel like a man watching his neighbor's mango tree bear fruit he could smell but never taste. The service unfolded with the usual choreography of hymns, readings, and call and response, but the undercurrent was different, like a familiar river that had suddenly learned a new song. When the pastor took the pulpit, his voice had a buoyancy as though it had been given extra air, and he spoke of community upliftment, of divine timing, of seeds that grow quietly before breaking the soil. Jonah tried to focus on the words, but his eyes kept drifting toward Miriam and the governor seated in the front pew. She listened with the same composure she always had, hands folded neatly over her lap, but there was a new weight to her presence, as though life had draped her shoulders with a mantle invisible to most but undeniable to those who had known her before. Jonah wondered if she felt the eyes on her, if she noticed how the congregation's glances lingered a second longer than necessary, how even the choir's soprano seemed to pitch her notes in Miriam's direction. The sermon reached its peak, the organ swelled, and Jonah's own thoughts drowned in the sound. He remembered the way he had mocked her that Sunday months ago, the careless words thrown like stones at a surface he had not bothered to test for depth. Now, watching her, he felt as though he had tossed those stones into a well so deep that they had landed in another world entirely, one from which her present self had been drawn. His chest tightened as the pastor announced the time for testimonies, and several people stood to speak of blessings received and prayers answered. Jonah remained seated, staring at his hands as if they might confess to something on their own. He felt the shape of absence pressing against him, not the absence of love or even friendship, but the absence of a place in her story. When the final hymn was sung and the benediction given, the congregation spilled out into the churchyard like a pot boiling over, everyone eager to greet the governor, to shake his hand, to be seen in the periphery of power. Jonah lingered near the back, watching the press of bodies, the sparkle of smiles, the quick, strategic exchanges of words. Miriam moved through it all with the same unhurried grace, offering greetings, thanking people for their kind words, listening to the snippets of prayer and praise thrown her way. At one point, her gaze swept across the crowd and landed on Jonah. It was not the piercing glance of confrontation, nor the warm recognition of shared history. It was the even, steady acknowledgement you give to a face you once knew in a chapter long concluded. She nodded once, faintly, then turned to respond to an elder who was speaking to her about a youth program in Bonnie. The moment was over before Jonah could decide what to do with it, and he felt it slip from his grasp like a fish wriggling back into the water. The governor stood nearby, engaged in conversation with the pastor, his posture relaxed yet alert, the way men in his position often were. Jonah realized with a dull thud of clarity that the circles they occupied now barely overlapped. Their orbits had drifted so far apart that any intersection would be brief and incidental, a crossing of paths rather than a meeting of lives. As the crowd began to thin and the convoy prepared to leave, Jonah found himself drifting toward the gate, his steps neither hurried nor reluctant, just following the pull of departure. The sun had climbed higher, laying a sharper heat across the yard, and the scent of hibiscus from the church garden mingled with the smell of warm dust. He paused under the almond tree, watching as Miriam stepped into the back seat of the governor's car, her movements measured, unflustered by the cameras and curious stares. The door closed with a soft, definitive click, and in that sound Jonah heard something final, an invisible latch sliding into place, sealing off a room he would never enter. The engine started, the convoy moved, and dust rose like a curtain drawing down on a scene. Jonah stood there until the road was empty again, until the air had settled back into the everyday quiet of Okori Bend. Old Tamuno passed by, carrying a bundle of fishing lines, and gave Jonah a glance that felt like it had read every page of his thoughts. "When the canoe you mocked sails past you," the old man said without breaking stride, "you learn the river remembers." Jonah didn't answer. He only watched the dust trail fade, knowing that some distances, once opened, refused to close, no matter how many steps you take toward them. The change did not arrive like a parade with trumpets. It came like dew, quiet and insistent, settling on everything until the whole town shone with a new kind of wet light that would not evaporate even after the sun had spoken. In the days after the church announcement, lorries rumbled along the laterite road from the direction of Elim, carrying gravel that glinted like a promise, and men in reflective vests staked strings and pounded pegs, as if they were sewing a new hem around Okori Bend. The first patch of potholes disappeared under hot tar, and people began to walk with their chins lifted, because a smooth road asks your neck to believe in tomorrow. Near the market where the harbor smell of Port Harcourt sometimes drifted in on a tired breeze, carpenters measured and sawed, replacing warped planks with fresh timber, raising stalls that stood straight like schoolchildren during assembly. A lean man from the ministry stood with a clipboard at the edge of the square, and asked questions in a calm river of ink, and the answers pooled into boxes that he ticked with a patient wrist. A solar-powered borehole began to rise where the ground had been complaining for years. The women watched without clapping, arms folded, measuring the work with the same eyes they used for yam and beer money. Security men appeared in neat doubles, their boots marking the edge between yesterday and the new order. Their presence was not oppressive, just tall, like trees that forgot to sway. Vendors trimmed their stalls with fresh raffia, and the plantain woman who had always fought with her scale acquired a new one, the kind that blinked digital numbers as if reading out loud for everyone to witness. People said the governor had a soft spot for his mother's town, and that Miriam's voice now climbed rooms that had once ignored local speech. They said it lightly, as if discussing the weather, but it altered how backs straightened and decisions were made. Jonah watched all this with a face that learned stillness, a fisherman's practiced mask, and told himself it was good that good things were happening. He said it aloud to no one. "Water is water, me I will still cast my net." Yet beneath the words, some fine, tight instrument twanged whenever he passed a new stall, whenever he saw a ditch filled and a culvert open its round mouth to swallow rain without spitting it back into people's rooms. At the river bank in the evenings, boys now kicked a football on a level patch where old puddles had retired. Their shouts stitched the dusk with a carefree thread, and twice he caught himself smiling before remembering that joy could be expensive if you had not paid the right price at the right time. He ran his small trade with a discipline borrowed from hunger, making runs to Port Harcourt and back, selling to F, sometimes to a restaurant near Diobu that had learned his name and greeted him with peppered smiles, and every time the boat churned through the creeks he steered as if technique alone could keep thoughts from climbing aboard. But memory is a stowaway. It crouches under tarpaulin, rides in baskets, peeks over gunnels, and stretches when the sun is soft. One afternoon, steering past Abanima's wooden stilts and the listening mangroves, he remembered a day in secondary school when he had laughed at a boy for mispronouncing a word during speech contest, and how the boy had later stood on a different stage in Port Harcourt, years older, his voice butter-smooth, accepting an award that glittered like a small, well-fed fish. The recollection pressed on his chest with a thumb too familiar to shrug away. He sold his catch, counted his money with careful fingers, and allowed the city to jostle around him. Hawkers calling like birds with human tongues, kiki horns making punctuation out of air, the smell of mechanics' sweat and diesel piping a crude symphony along Iwolf Road. He bought spare line from a shop that refused to haggle, and found himself standing outside a boutique where mannequins wore lives he did not recognize. Inside, under white lights that had no patience for shadows, a cream-colored dress hung still as a secret, and its plain beauty reminded him of Miriam's steady way of walking. He left without entering, irritated by his own sentimentality, and ate a plate of jollof whose pepper taught his thoughts to behave for a while. On the bus back, the seat springs held him the way an old chair holds a long story, reluctantly but without scandal, and a woman cradled a sleeping child on his shoulder for a few stops, apologizing in a whisper that made him ache for no good reason. He watched the road signs, Elelanwo, Rimuolumini Choba, tick past like beads on a prayer he had never learned, and closed his eyes when the bus finally bumped onto the newly leveled stretch toward home, grateful, somehow, that the ride no longer bruised so much. A week later, on a humid afternoon that made the church roof sweat metal tears, he turned a corner near the town hall, and almost collided with the small procession that moved with the neat inevitability of a fountain. Miriam at the center, a folder in her hand, two aides swinging clipboards, a uniformed officer a step behind her like punctuation that insists on being read. She wore a soft brown wrapper with a patterned blouse that looked both ordinary and ironed by intention. Her cheeks had no powder of arrogance on them, and when she saw him she paused just enough to turn a passing moment into a meeting. "Jonah," she said, and the name left her mouth gently, like a boat pushed off a calm shore. He felt something in embrace, and then lower its arms, confused by the absence of defense to deploy. He greeted her back, Miriam, and managed a smile that did not show his teeth, because anything more would have been a plea. The officer looked away politely, interested in an invisible detail a few meters away, while one aide checked a list and murmured about vendors from Okrika, another about deliveries timed for the road from ABA. "How is fishing?" she asked, voice clean, curiosity neither feigned nor too curious, and he answered truthfully that the tides had been kind when the moon behaved, that the channels were shifting but not treacherous. She nodded, pleased to have been offered news that smelled like work and not performance. The silence that followed could have been an awkward pothole. Instead it felt like a small, fenced garden where nothing grew except mutual respect trimmed short. He looked for an apology in his pocket, but his hands found only the lint of 1,000 unsentences. If she remembered the mockery outside St. Ida's, she carried it like a feather in a thick book, present perhaps, but not worth disturbing the page you are on. "I'm glad the road near the jetty is being fixed," he said, and her eyes warmed a measure, pleased not at his endorsement, but at the thought of a pregnant woman no longer stumbling on old stones. "We are trying," she replied. The pronoun wrapped a perimeter around a new identity without rubbing it in anyone's face. She glanced at the time, then at the officers whose patience understood hierarchy, and she offered him a small, steady smile that belonged to the day they were living, not the days they had misplaced. As she moved on, the officer fell back into step, the aides resumed their murmurs, and the little fountain continued to pour itself toward the tasks that had learned her name. He stood there long after the corridor of their departure had closed, tasting the sweetness and salt of a polite greeting that had left no wound and no doorway. Evenings grew longer because he spent more time inside them, sitting with old Tamuno on the broken bench that had mastered the art of not collapsing, watching the river tint itself the color of palm wine before dark. The old man mended nets as if weaving forgiveness between knots, and his sentences came the way fish sometimes come when the water forgets to be shy, without splash, without warning, simply present in his lap. "A man is not a proverb until life proves him," he said one night, as bats drew cursive on the sky and a generator in the distance coughed itself into a rhythm. Jonah grunted, which was his way of admitting entry. "You have learned that a woman's silence can be a road," Tamuno continued, thumbs smoothing twine. "But you must also learn that your own laughter had legs. It ran ahead and wrote your name in a corner you didn't see." The words stung without malice. Jonah turned the thought in his mouth like roasted groundnuts, chewing until it softened into something he could swallow. He confessed, softly, to the water more than to the elder, that he had felt small when he greeted Miriam, not because she had grown taller, but because he finally saw how high she had always been standing. Tamuno chuckled, a sound like sand deciding to be friendly with feet. "Port Harcourt has skyscrapers," the old man said, "but the tallest building is a person who refuses to bend where it matters." They spoke of other things too, of a cousin in Benin City whose shop had survived flood by courting the neighbor's favor, of a boy in ABA who learned to sew by promising his eyes they would not sleep until the stitches obeyed, of a rumor that the health center's plot had been surveyed with tape that did not lie. When they fell quiet again, the river bargained with the night in small, wet whispers. Before they parted, Tamuno touched Jonah's wrist with a father's permission. "Regret is a mosquito," he said, smiling into the darkness. "You can't win by slapping the air all night. Light a coil, change your habits." Jonah walked home slowly and did not turn to watch the water, afraid it might be holding up a mirror. In his room, he counted his day's money, set aside a handful for net repair, and placed 2 notes under a stone for his mother's offering plate, a plate that existed now only in his memory but still demanded respect. Sleep came late, and when it did it brought a dream where he stood in a Port Harcourt rain, hands empty, watching an umbrella walk away on legs he recognized and wished well. The announcement came without warning, tucked inside the chatter of the market like a ripe fruit hidden in plain sight. Word spread that the governor and his fiancée would be returning to O'Corry Bend for a public commissioning, something about the borehole near the school and the new tarred road toward the jetty. By mid-morning, the town had already put on its best skin, wrappers in sharp prints that looked like flags for invisible kingdoms, shirts ironed until they whispered under the sun, sandals scrubbed free of yesterday's dust. Jonah heard the news while repairing his net by the river, his hands moving on their own while his mind strayed toward the image of Miriam stepping out of the black SUV. He told himself it would be like any other visit, just a formality, but the thought didn't sit quietly. It paced inside him, wearing grooves into the floor of his chest. When the sound of distant engines rolled over the mangroves like thunder without rain, people began moving toward the square, some walking quickly, others with the slow, calculated steps of those who believe arrival should be savored. Jonah joined the stream, not at the front, not at the back, his pace carrying the rhythm of a man who hadn't yet decided if he was going somewhere or leaving something behind. The convoy entered in a line so clean it could have been drawn by a ruler, engines purring like big cats that knew they were being watched. Children's laughter bubbled over the hum of the crowd, and the air smelled faintly of roasted maize and new tar. The vehicle stopped in front of the old town hall, and when the door of the first SUV opened, the governor stepped out with his practiced blend of warmth and authority, greeting the chiefs, shaking hands with the men who carried influence in their pockets like folded maps. Then Miriam emerged, dressed in a deep blue wrapper that caught the light like water under a cloudless sky. The crowd's murmur lifted, softened, then settled, as though the moment had been padded with something fragile. She moved with an ease that suggested this was no longer an interruption to her life, but part of its natural tide. Jonah stood in the crowd, invisible to her line of sight, his eyes following her like a fisherman tracking the ripple of a fish he knows he will never catch. The ceremony unfolded in the deliberate rhythm that such occasions demand. The governor gave his speech first, speaking of development, of keeping promises, of a future where O'Corry Bend would not have to choose between dignity and distance. His voice carried over the crowd, steady as a drumbeat in the evening air, and each pause was filled with nods and murmured assent. Miriam stood just behind him, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze attentive without being performative. When she was invited to say a few words, she stepped forward without hesitation. Her voice, though not loud, reached every ear, shaped by the kind of clarity that comes from speaking only what you mean. She thanked the governor, the community, and the women whose daily labor kept the market alive. She spoke of clean water not as a gift but as a right, and of roads not as favors but as necessities. Jonah listened, caught between pride that she carried her words like well-balanced baskets, and a pang at realizing that nothing in her tone belonged to the version of her he had once known. The applause that followed wrapped her in a warm, collective embrace, and Jonah clapped too, his hands moving without his permission. The ribbon cutting was quick, the boreholes pump tested, water gushing into a waiting basin with the clarity of new beginnings. Children gathered around, splashing their fingers, laughing as though they had been told a secret only they could understand. The governor and Miriam moved through the crowd afterward, greeting people, accepting blessings, and posing for photographs. Jonah stayed where he was, close enough to see the curve of her smile, far enough that their eyes never met. He found himself memorizing details that didn't belong to him. The tilt of her head when she listened, the way she rested a hand lightly on an elder's shoulder, the way she seemed both entirely here and already walking into the next place she would be needed. As the afternoon thinned into early evening, the convoy prepared to leave. The sun had begun to lean toward the river, casting long shadows that made the road look older than it was. Jonah drifted to the roadside with the rest of the crowd, the dust underfoot warm from the day's footsteps. When the governor's vehicle rolled forward, Miriam was already seated, her profile framed by the window like a portrait someone had painted with patience and intention. For a heartbeat, her eyes lifted, scanning the crowd, and found him. The recognition was brief, like the flicker of a lantern before the wind claims it, but it was enough to send a small tremor through his chest. She smiled, not the smile of shared history, not an invitation, but the gentle acknowledgement one might give to a familiar landmark glimpsed from a passing train. He nodded in return, unsure if she saw it before the car moved on. The dust rose in the convoy's wake, curling into the air before settling over the road like a second skin. Around him, people began to disperse, their conversations already shifting toward dinner and the next day's errands. Jonah stayed a moment longer, watching the road until it curved out of sight, as if expecting it to give something back. But roads only take, they rarely return. When he finally turned away, the town had begun to return to its usual pulse. The market women were packing up their goods, folding cloths over baskets, tying wrappers tighter against the evening chill. Children carried smaller siblings on their backs, their steps quick with the promise of food at home. Jonah walked toward the river, his shadow stretching ahead of him, thin and tired. The air was cooler here, touched by the breath of water, and the smell of wet wood rose from the jetty. He sat on the edge, letting his feet dangle just above the rippling surface. The nets lay in a heap beside him, their weight familiar, dependable. He thought of the months that had passed since that day outside the church, how laughter had seemed like a harmless stone to skip across a shallow pool. He knew better now. Some waters are deeper than they look, and some stones sink straight to the bottom without ever making a sound. The sky darkened slowly, as if reluctant to close its eyes, and Jonah remained where he was, listening to the river speak in its low, patient voice. The words were not clear, but their meaning pressed into him all the same. Life moves forward, with or without your consent, and all you can do is keep paddling, even when the current is not yours. When he rose at last, the first stars were already stitching themselves into the night, and the path home lay waiting, quiet and unremarkable, as though the day had not happened at all. But in his chest, a new space had opened. Empty, yes, but also wide enough to hold something different, should it ever come. My people, in this life, never look down on the road another person is walking. You don't know where their steps will lead them tomorrow. Words are like seeds. Once they leave your mouth, they can grow into trees you never planned. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Quietly. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story. That no one can close. May you meet people who value your worth before the world applauds you. And may your laughter always be from joy, not from regret. If you believe this, shout a big amen.